To pay or not to pay? Should governments save kidnapped victims by paying out ransoms, or does that just encourage terror groups to take more captives? You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. Well, scores of kidnapped girls were released very suddenly last week by the Nigerian militants Boko Haram. Nigeria's government denying that any ransom was paid for their freedom. But why the concerns about ransoms? Isn't it perhaps a price worth paying to save lives? Or perhaps it just proves to militants that their methods work.
It's believed that ISIS was holding these two men.
You're gonna be beheaded, always a threat hanging over your head.
We now have a military situation here.
The kidnapping of nearly 300 schoolgirls in Nigeria.
The way a government reacts to a hostage taking can define the legacy of an administration. But do officials put public relations above the safety of their citizens when they pay a ransom, saving a life now, but perhaps risking many more in the future? In Nigeria, the Boko Haram insurgency has made hostage situations a national concern. The Nigerian government claims not to pay ransoms, but the return of 104 kidnapped schoolgirls from Dapchi in the country's northeast has people asking questions. Shortly after the girls were returned, the country's information minister released a statement saying no ransom was paid to them to effect this release. But reports are circulating that the state may have paid as much as $3.7 million for the release of hostages in 2017, casting doubt over the government's statement and fueling concerns that a government willing to pay for hostages, covertly or otherwise, will only encourage more kidnappings. In the past, the United States has made its position on hostage negotiations very clear.
First of all, the United States of America does not pay ransom.
We do not pay ransom for hostages.
We, of course, don't pay ransom for any hostages.
And alongside other global powers like the United Kingdom, it follows a simple principle.
Providing ransoms to terrorist organizations only gives those terrorist organizations access to more funds and resources. It also makes American citizens more likely targets of terrorist organizations.
But despite a 2013 agreement among G8 nations not to pay ransoms to terrorist organizations, France, Italy, and Germany have secured the release of their nationals from hostile groups, allegedly through ransom payments. Governments willing to pay a ransom walk a dangerous line. When the eyes of the world are watching, payments made to hostage takers set a precedent, and one that could cost dearly down the road.
Well, I'm very pleased to say that joining me at the round table we have Yvonne Ridley, journalist who was kidnapped by the Taliban in 2001 and held captive for 11 days. We have Temitope Olodo, president of the Africa Safety Forum, and Robert Fox, the defence editor of the London Evening Standard. Very good to have you all here. First of all, show of hands or nods or whatever, does anybody believe that the Nigerian government did not pay a ransom? Okay, so we think they lied. Why would they lie?
There are different political reasons for that. Although the president made it very clear that he would do anything to get the girls back. But as we approach 2019, the president cannot have this hanging on his head, so he has no choice than to proceed by getting the girls whichever way he could. The reasoning behind not making it clear that money was paid, I still do not understand it. I don't know if it's due to the fact they're afraid it might be a sign of weakness, but I don't think it is weakness for paying for those girls.
So does everybody pay up and then lie about it? Well, first.
I think in the case of the UK, which is, I think, probably the really interesting one, they have a very puritanical government line which conceals the truth. They don't necessarily lie. Where we are from London, just a few miles up the road to the east, there is a whole industry, multinational, that works on ransom, kidnap, security, and so forth.
This is the insurance business.
The insurance business, but it's also proactive in that they will have people whom I know or who go in and at great risk to life and limb when we'll try and get people out if it doesn't work. It's a very high-risk business, and it's particularly vulnerable not only for governments, where government agencies are concerned, of course, particularly where multinational industries, and above all, since we're talking about Nigeria, the oil and gas industry. But can I just move on from what you were saying? I think there's something to this, that we're far too British about this and seeing it as black, white, as binary. Yeah. It isn't. Yeah. I think possibly the president of Nigeria, within the letter, was right, because they would have done it through third-party agencies. Yeah. And it's the agencying of it, because then you go into this being a whole part of not only of an economy, of individual, community, warlord economies. It's a whole way of life.
So Yvonne, do jump in, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, or payment in kind, or exchanging one group of hostages for maybe prisoners of value.
Which is what the US did. It said we won't pay, but we'll hand over some of our prisoners for Baghdad, wasn't it?
Yes.
In other cases.
5 high-value Taliban commanders were released from Guantanamo and exchanged for Baghdad.
You see,
and by the way, it happened with the British in let's be absolutely clear, in southern Iraq, with Fatoussi, when they got him out, when there was one British soldier being killed and others injured per patrol in Basra in the bad days. So let's be clear, to say that the Brits have never done it, this is absolutely not true. The record shows that it's not true.
We've got a moral dilemma and a practical dilemma. Let's talk about the practical side first of all with you. 2001, you were taken, you were held captive. Did you expect help from the British government?
Absolutely not. And to the amazement of my captors, I told them so. They said, you know, Tony Blair will be concerned that we have you. And I said, Tony Blair will be sorry that there aren't 10 more journalists like me locked up. I said he couldn't, he's not going to care. And I said,
and what did your captors do?
Well, they were surprised, and I said the British government will not hand over a penny for me. They won't sit down and talk to terrorists, and as far as they're concerned, that's exactly what you are.
So you then had to look to somebody else, your boss in this case, perhaps for help?
Well, unbeknown to me, my publisher, Richard Desmond, of Express newspapers, sent out a team, and they did a brilliant job with little or no help, I have to say, from the British government, and that has never been made entirely clear. But they did a superb job by going to the Taliban, sitting down with them and negotiating with them. I subsequently found out that Richard Desmond had sent his man with a checkbook saying 1 million, 2 million, whatever it takes.
So there wasn't an upper limit for you then?
Well, it was whatever it takes.
Well, at least it had millions after. Well done.
Just bring her back. And he said they don't want money. They're not interested in money. And this was an anathema to Richard Desmond, who is, you know, a very tough negotiator in business. And he said, well, what do they want? And they wanted to see, is she a British spy, as they thought, or is she really a journalist? And in the end, they released me on humanitarian grounds. No money exchanged at all.
Extraordinary. I mean, the broader question is here, does it really matter? Does it make any difference if there's an international policy or if there isn't, if it's just done on an ad hoc basis?
I think it doesn't really matter. I think what matters is what strategy we have in place to ensure that it doesn't happen again. In the case of Nigeria, for example, and in the case of Cameroon and other neighboring country that is ravaged by the menace of Boko Haram, what is very, very clear is that they could go around and kidnap as many people or adopt as many people as they want because there is no policy to contain them. If you look at Cameroon, for example, they went after the wife of the deputy president or prime minister, and she was released because there was exchange of money. They went after some Chinese businessmen, and the fact is that these individuals need resources to sustain themselves, to sustain their ideology. So what we need to do is find out who is funding these individuals, how are they getting their fund apart from the adoption, and how can we just cut them in to reduce the
But that is how you perhaps get rid of the initial problem, but
Yes.
not the means by which they perhaps generate income for themselves. If they exist, does it matter how we deal with them? Moral or practical dilemma there?
I think that you have to take it case by case, and I think you have to be very tough, and you do need a strategy, because going on from Yvonne's time in Afghanistan, the thing that went terribly, terribly wrong and cost lives was that different nations had different approaches. I mean, the Italians would pay Danegeld, the equivalent of the Vikings in the Dark Ages here are paying the Vikings to go away. And there was a notorious case, you may remember, on the borders of Ghazni province, south of Kabul, where the Italians had been there, and amazingly, it had been as quiet as anything. It'd been like the Garden of Eden. The French came in, a very good French military unit. I mean, you can't say that they fell down on the job, because they were disciplined. I think they were paras, and they had an awful period of strikes from the very beginning. And it turned out, when they talked to the Taliban leadership, that of course, well, you wouldn't pay the money. We didn't get the money from you, which we got from the Italians. And the Italians told us when they left that you were going to pay. There was a tremendous row that went on and on and on. And the Italian ambassador here, now several issues back, was in absolute denial about it, and yet everybody knew that this had happened. All our Afghan contacts showed that this would happen. And now, how do you work?
If you talk about the international hostages, I go back to James Foley, who was beheaded in the Middle East. It was said by people who had been held with him, that their countries paid ransoms, they were allowed out. Another country paid ransoms, Italians, French, I think. They were let out, but because the US wouldn't pay, he lost his life. So is it worth paying?
Well, I'm sort of on two minds with this. I don't think that government should pay. However, I think if individual employers like Richard Desmond, or families like James Foley's family, want to try and find other routes to get their loved ones out, it should be allowed. And I think that that governments should back off in cases where employees say, we're going to go in and negotiate, which is what happened in my case. The British government wouldn't have anything to do with the Taliban. That's fine. I expected that. But Richard Desmond, as I say, went in.
But by and large, is that what you think, because you've spent a long time sort of looking at different cases in the intervening years, by and large, is that what you believe actually happens, is that a government will say, no, we can't, but on the other hand, if you want to do that, then we're not going to stand in your way, we might even help a little bit.
You see, it's very fine for us to sit in a studio and say, oh, we shouldn't pay. But just recently I have spoken to some Syrian women who have gone through unimaginable abuse in Assad's prisons. And after listening to their stories, there are 7,000 women in Assad's prisons. I would sup tea with the devil just to get one of those women out.
And particularly the cases of the Yazidis too, which have been absolutely horrible, the treatment of their women. Can I just move the debate on, because I think there is a new phenomenon, and it's crowdsourcing to raise ransoms, which is a recognised OC method, organised crime. Can I just quickly relate a bizarre television event where television and reality, a television drama, absolutely collided just a few days ago here in the UK, because they've been showing a kidnap for ransom movie drama called Under the Skin. They had to suspend.
Was this Danish?
Yes.
Or it was Scandinavian?
Can we explain why they had to suspend it? They had to suspend it because of the incident at Trèbes and Carcassonne, where the gendarmerie colonel substituted himself for a hostage and was killed. From what I can understand, the methodology was the same in both cases. And the BBC, I think it's somewhat naive, but obviously was leaned on to suspend the series.
Or perhaps it was a matter of taste.
Question of taste, but it's also a bit of a playbook too, as to how to do it. And I don't think that you suspend or censor it for that reason, because these things go on, and we should understand the mechanism. If we could go back to sort of deep dark ages educational history, there was an episode before England really became a nation, it's in the Middle Ages, of the 100 Years' War, so-called, with France. It's not really written about, even today, with glossy TV series about it. What drove the 100 Years' War? It was a war of ransom and kidnap. That's why you went to war. You didn't go for Harry and England and St. George, as Shakespeare put it. You went because this is the way you could make money, and you really made your money if you could kidnap the other side. So kidnap is so much part of nation-state society.
Yeah. So it's perhaps the second oldest profession.
Yes.
So why come 2013 would the G8, and then followed by the United Nations Security Council, adopt a broad policy saying we're going to change what's been happening for millennia? Why would they?
A cynic would say hypocrisy. But the hypocrisy is worth looking into. It is a huge business. It does undermine policy, and exactly as you said, otherwise they look incoherent. I mean, they had at the same time they had a convention against the mafias.
Yes.
And where was the convention signed in Naples?
But some of the criminals are sanctioned by the state.
Yes.
You know, going back to Syria again, it is a fact that women are being used to make money, and they are returned to their families who paid thousands of dollars of money to get their wives, daughters.
Are you talking about women who've been held by the government in Syria in this case, or held by other groups in Syria?
No, held by the Assad government.
So there's effectively some kind of exchange, is there?
Yes, one woman I spoke to, her brother paid $17,000 to the local military intelligence in Damascus to get her out of prison. And unfortunately, he ended up in prison because he was unable to pay the debt in the end. But, you know, $17,000 is a huge amount. And multiply that by the amount of women. And you think, well, don't pay it, and then they'll stop asking.
Well, this was my next question. Is it, if you pay it, is it not encouraging that activity to continue?
Well, yes, in some ways, but having sat and spoken to these women and to know that the abuse that they're facing, and we're talking rape on an industrial scale. I've been covering stories of prisons and hostages all my career, you know, more than 40 years in journalism, and I have never come across such depravity and cruelty and brutality as is practiced in the Assad jails on such an industrial scale. And as I said to you before, I would sit and sup tea with the devil if I could get one of those 7,000 women out of those prisons now. And it is a moral dilemma, because I would say, forget the rules, forget the regulations, give me the money, let me get those women
Sometimes
out now.
there's nothing you can do, I would imagine, in these circumstances. You once volunteered to take the place of a particular prisoner, and somebody said, if you go into that situation, that's the end of your life.
David Haynes, the aid worker who was held by ISIS, of course the big thing that ISIS or Daesh, whatever you want to call them, their big claim is we're starting this caliphate. So I thought, well, we'll just test and see how Islamic the Islamic State is. And so I made what is known as an Islamic intercession and said, I will exchange places with him, and the request was ignored, which exposed them for their hypocrisy. But something really resonated.
We should add that you converted to Islam. I think it was at the same time as
Well,
You were held
I
prisoner.
converted to Islam more than 2 years after.
Yeah. So you were trying to show that they weren't Islamic.
Yes. But also, there were a few Western hostages, but David was born just more than an hour from where I live in Scotland. His young child was about the same age as my daughter when I was taken. And I just thought, she's an adult now, she's well on her way to enjoying life. I'm going to do it. And I thought, worst case scenario is I'll try and be able to talk my way out of it. I just want to get this poor man out of this desperate situation.
Let's ask Temitope, but what did they reckon 10 years ago? These were the only figures I could find. That kidnapping and ransom in Nigeria was worth maybe $100 million every year. I'm sure the number has gone up since then. Two questions. I mean, there are people that you cannot deal with, as we saw with what Yvonne was saying. And secondly, the more you pay, not only does it perhaps encourage kidnapping, but does it not also push the market up and make it a more profitable business? That's what one of the guys at one of these risk companies you referred to, Bob, in London said. He said, governments are paying lots of money. What am I supposed to do?
In fact, in Nigeria, there are classic examples now of tenants who kidnap their landlords in order to get money for their landlords to pay him his rent. It's in the newspaper. It has happened. So,
well, that's
it has happened. So the concept of adopting and kidnapping, it's becoming big business even in Nigeria, to the extent that some states went for the death penalty. But what I wanted to also talk about is the narrative behind the adoption, like you rightly mentioned. That in some situations, it might not even be money-driven. It might just be political reasons. So what we've noticed in the south of Nigeria is that they had a different driver.
This is in the Delta?
In the Delta. They had a different driver. They want something within their community that shows that their community is valued and honored. And they kidnap Western, Western business people or people that work within the oil industry, in order to be able to get some money, to fund their objective and drivers. It's completely different from the North, because when you look at the Chibok girls, for example, which is a Christian community, most of the girls return and be pregnant and
a lot of them are still missing, aren't they, as well?
Yes.
Chibok.
Meanwhile, when you look at what happened in the Kapchi community, where the girls were taken, of course, unfortunately, 5 of them died out of exhaustion.
And one still held, and she's Christian.
Which is Christian. Yeah. And what the fear now is that they might maybe do something bad to her or return back. But we hope not. And with the pressure that is being put on them now, that they return the girls safely.
Can I just put this out there, and each one of you would have an opinion on this. Is there anything that could be done or should be done to facilitate, I don't know whether it's the release of the hostages or prevent them being taken in the first place? Is there anything that somebody can actually come up with and say, look, why don't we all do this?
Well, if we had such a thing as an international community, which we don't at the moment, the United Nations has no backbone. The United Nations Security Council can't even agree on the simplest of issues. And until we get a united front globally through some sort of organisation, I'm not quite sure how we can get the 7,000 women out of the prisons in Syria, how we can get these girls back in Nigeria, how we can stop this happening, because it's not just a question of making money. Some of these organisations want to make political points, so they want publicity, and which is something else that Daesh perfected with horrendous results by putting Westerners in Guantanamo-style outfits and parading them on TV.
Can I push that on to you, Robert? What
I think the big question is huge and cannot be addressed, and it's group mentality. Because one of the things that we have to say, from what Yvonne said, and it particularly touches women, but not exclusively, is the attitude to human life. Many of the communities we are talking about, particularly Afghanistan and the Middle East, a human life, a young human life, is in bond. We absolutely underestimate what bondage and slavery in the world. These people are chattels, and that's why I am quite critical of the holier-than-thou attitudes of some of the very industrialized NGOs because they do not speak truth to power and their own power of what the reality on the ground is. And if you make it work, and it's absolutely clear in all aid, it cannot be done by grand bargains and big discussions at very expensive summits. It has to be grown from the bottom up. And that is particularly the truth of what is going on in sub-Saharan Africa at the moment.
Do you see that happening in sub-Saharan?
I totally agree, because what we've noticed from the successes in terms of returning of some of the Chibok girls and even the captured girls, it's been broken by international organizations who some of these groups that have this narrative are calling for all who have a bit of trust in, because they don't have trust in the government itself.
Well, thank you all very much indeed for taking part in this discussion. There are people getting rich by collecting ransoms. There are people getting rich by negotiating with those who are collecting ransoms. But at the same time, there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of people probably held in miserable conditions who don't know whether they will ever see daylight properly again. You've been watching Roundtable. I'm David Foster. Thanks for your company. Hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.